Most technologies are introduced with announcements, press releases, demos, applause. But some were never supposed to be seen at all. They were built quietly, inside military labs, intelligence programs, and classified projects, designed for moments the public was never meant to witness. Not for everyday life, not for civilians, not for you. Yet somehow, they escaped. Not all at once, not by accident, but piece by piece, justified as temporary, necessary, or harmless. Today, these technologies sit in our pockets, watch our faces, predict our behavior, and shape decisions we never agreed to make. And the unsettling part isn't that they exist. It's that once they became public, they were never taken back. Tonight, we're looking at 10 technologies that were never meant to be public, and what changed the moment they were.
The technology was never announced. There was no prototype reveal, no public debate. It didn't need one. In the early years of the Cold War, fear wasn't hypothetical. It was operational. Governments weren't asking what if the enemy attacks. They were asking what if the enemy already controls the mind. So a quiet question took priority inside U.S. intelligence circles. Can human behavior be overwritten? Not influenced, not persuaded, rewritten. Project MKUltra was never meant to be a single experiment. It was a framework, a long series of attempts to map the limits of human control. Memory suppression, personality fracture, behavioral conditioning under chemical and psychological pressure. The technology wasn't mechanical. It didn't look like machines or screens. It looked like therapy, like medicine, like research. Subjects were exposed to combinations of psychoactive substances, sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, repetition, and psychological stress, often without consent. The goal wasn't compliance. It was predictability. If a stimulus could reliably trigger fear, if a phrase could induce obedience, if memory itself could be fragmented, then behavior could be engineered. What made MKUltra different wasn't cruelty. It was ambition. This wasn't about interrogation. It was about redesigning the human response system. And for years, it stayed where it was supposed to stay. Classified, fragmented, deniable, until it didn't. In the 1970s, documents surfaced. Not the full archive, most of it was already destroyed, but enough to reveal the structure. What shocked the public wasn't just what had been done. It was how calmly it had been justified. The technology wasn't labeled dangerous. It was labeled unfinished. And that distinction mattered, because once the concept existed, that the human mind could be conditioned, disrupted, and reassembled, it stopped belonging to a single program. The methods migrated. Behavioral psychology adopted parts of it. Advertising refined it. Interrogation manuals adapted it. Digital environments quietly borrowed its logic. Trigger, response, reinforcement. The tools became softer. The language became cleaner. But the architecture remained. Today, no one needs a lab to test behavioral conditioning. It runs constantly, through screens, interfaces, feedback loops, and attention systems. You don't need chemicals to fragment focus. You don't need isolation chambers to reshape behavior. You just need repetition, timing, and incentives. Project MKUltra was never meant to teach the public how minds could be shaped. But once it became known, the question was no longer can this be done? It became how quietly can it be done now? And that's what makes this technology different from a failed experiment. It didn't end. It dispersed. Not as a program, but as a principle. The internet didn't begin with curiosity. It began with fear. In the late 1960s, the question wasn't how to connect people. It was how to survive a nuclear war. If a single attack could erase communication, command would collapse. And if command collapsed, control was lost. So a solution was designed, quietly, inside U.S. defense research. It was called ARPANET, not a network for conversation, not a marketplace, not a social space. A decentralized communication system built to function even if parts of it were destroyed. No center, no single point of failure, no assumption of trust. The goal wasn't speed, it was endurance. Messages were broken into packets, scattered across multiple paths, and reassembled only at their destination. If one route failed, another would carry the signal.
It was a system designed under the assumption that something would go wrong. That assumption never left. ARPANET was never meant to be public infrastructure. It was a contingency system, a backup for the unthinkable. But as the Cold War stabilized, the technology outlived its original purpose. Universities were connected. Research institutions followed. Then corporations. Each step justified as practical. Each expansion described as temporary. At no point did anyone stop and ask whether the architecture itself should change. Because the architecture still worked. By the time the public arrived, the foundation was already locked in. A system designed to root around destruction became a system that roots around authority. A network built for survival became one optimized for persistence. Nothing was rebuilt. Nothing was reset. The public didn't inherit a blank canvas. They inherited a war machine that happened to carry information. And that mattered. Because a network designed without a center doesn't naturally produce accountability. A system built to survive collapse doesn't prioritize transparency. And an infrastructure optimized for continuity doesn't care what flows through it, only that it keeps flowing. Over time, new layers were added. Browsers, platforms, interfaces. They made the system feel friendly, intuitive, safe, but the core logic never changed. The internet still assumes disruption, still fragments information, still routes signals through invisible pathways beyond the user's control. It doesn't ask who you are. It doesn't ask what should be seen. It doesn't ask what should stop. It simply continues. And once that system was released into civilian life, it could never be reclaimed. Governments tried to regulate it. Corporations tried to centralize it. Users tried to personalize it. But none of them owned the foundation. Because it was never built for them. The most consequential technology of the modern world wasn't introduced with a vision for society. It was deployed with a plan for survival. And everything that followed, commerce, culture, surveillance, misinformation, grew on top of that original design. Not because anyone planned it, but because no one stopped it. The internet wasn't meant to be public. It was meant to keep going, no matter what happened above it. The systems didn't appear after the crisis. They were already there, long before public debates about privacy, before emergency laws, before anyone agreed to be watched. Governments were already building ways to observe entire populations at once. Not individuals, patterns. In the late 20th century, intelligence agencies faced a new problem. Information was no longer scarce. It was overwhelming. Phone calls, financial records, travel logs, early digital communications. The challenge wasn't access. It was synthesis. So the focus shifted. Instead of tracking suspects, analysts began designing systems that could map behavior itself. Who spoke to whom? How often? From where? And in what sequence? The technology wasn't invasive in the traditional sense. It didn't listen to conversations. It didn't read content. It watched relationships. Surveillance algorithms were built to detect anomalies, deviations from what was considered normal behavior across large datasets. No warrants required. No individualized suspicion. Just math. If someone moved differently, communicated differently, connected differently, the system noticed. These programs weren't public because they didn't need to be. They operated behind layers of classification, justified as experimental, incomplete, or purely defensive. There was no announcement because there was no public role. The public wasn't the subject. It was the environment. By the time the internet expanded and digital records multiplied, these systems quietly scaled with it. More data meant clearer patterns. Clearer patterns meant fewer questions. Then came the turning point. After major security failures, the question was no longer whether surveillance should exist. It was why it hadn't been used more aggressively. Suddenly, technologies that had lived in shadows were presented as necessities. Not new tools, but dormant ones. What changed wasn't capability. It was permission. Frameworks designed without consent were retroactively justified by fear. Systems that had never been voted on were suddenly described as protections everyone had agreed to. But the architecture told a different story. These systems weren't designed to watch temporarily. They were designed to watch continuously. They didn't distinguish between threat and citizen. They distinguished between signal and noise. And everyone produced signal. Over time, the logic spread. Private companies adopted similar models.
Platforms optimized engagement through behavioral prediction. Advertisers refined influence through pattern recognition. The same math, different incentives. What once flagged anomalies now optimized attention. What once mapped networks now shaped them. And the most unsettling part wasn't that surveillance expanded. It was that it became invisible. There were no cameras to point at, no microphones to unplug, just data flows, correlations, probabilities, all operating below the threshold of human awareness. You don't feel watched by an algorithm. You feel guided, suggested, redirected, anticipated. Mass surveillance was never meant to be debated in public. It was built to function without friction. And once it stepped into civilian life, it didn't need force to stay. It only needed normalization. Because a system that watches everything doesn't have to intervene often. It just has to be there, waiting for patterns to repeat. The technology worked perfectly. That was the problem. When the global positioning system became operational, it delivered something no civilian tool had ever offered before. Absolute precision. Exact location. Exact timing. Anywhere on Earth. And from the beginning, that level of accuracy was considered dangerous. GPS was not built for navigation apps. It wasn't designed to help people find restaurants or track morning runs. It was built for missiles, to guide weapons across continents, to coordinate forces with split-second accuracy, to remove uncertainty from warfare. So when the system became available beyond the military, a decision was made quietly. The signal would be shared, but only a broken version. This limitation was called selective availability. Civilian GPS signals were deliberately degraded. Locations could drift by dozens, sometimes hundreds of meters. Timing was slightly off. Precision was blurred. Not because the technology couldn't do better, but because it wasn't supposed to. Accuracy was classified as a strategic advantage. And strategic advantages weren't meant to be public. For years, most users didn't know. They assumed the inaccuracy was technical. An early limitation. A bug. It wasn't. The system was working exactly as designed. Military receivers saw the world clearly. Everyone else saw a softened version. Just accurate enough to be useful, but never enough to be dangerous. And that distinction mattered, because precision changes behavior. Accurate positioning enables coordination. Coordination enables automation. Automation enables control. As long as civilian GPS remained imperfect, those capabilities stayed limited. But pressure grew. Commercial aviation wanted better navigation. Shipping demanded tighter logistics. Emergency services needed reliability. The question wasn't whether GPS could be precise. It was whether that precision could be trusted in civilian hands. In the year 2000, the restriction was removed. With a single announcement, the signal sharpened. Overnight, accuracy improved by an order of magnitude. Cars knew exactly where they were. Phones became location-aware. Systems began to synchronize with unprecedented precision. What was rarely discussed was what else had just changed. Because GPS isn't just about location. It's about timing. Financial markets depend on it. Power grids rely on it. Communication networks synchronize through it. A system once designed to guide weapons was now quietly coordinating civilian infrastructure. And there was no off switch. Selective availability had acted as a buffer, a soft barrier between military-grade precision and everyday life. Once removed, it was never reinstated. Not after conflicts, not after misuse, not after dependence set in. Because by then, society had reorganized itself around accuracy. Delivery systems, ride-sharing, autonomous machines, surveillance, all assumed GPS would always be there. And always be exact. But the system still belonged to its original architects. Civilian life now relied on a technology that could be altered, degraded, or denied at any moment. The accuracy wasn't democratized. It was loaned. GPS was never meant to be public at full strength. It was released carefully, reluctantly, and temporarily. What changed wasn't the technology. It was the decision to trust that precision wouldn't reshape power itself. And once that decision was made, there was no way to take it back.
The first question was never about identity. It was about survival. On a battlefield, hesitation costs lives. Decisions can't wait for confirmation. And uncertainty is a liability.
So military researchers began asking a different kind of question. Can a machine recognize a person faster than a human can doubt? Facial recognition didn't start in airports or smartphones. It didn't begin as a convenience feature. It was developed to solve a tactical problem. In conflict zones, soldiers needed to distinguish allies from enemies, often in seconds, often at a distance, often with incomplete information. Names didn't matter. Intent did. Early systems were trained to detect faces under extreme conditions. Poor lighting, partial visibility, stress, motion. The goal wasn't accuracy in a laboratory. It was speed in chaos. If a system could flag a face as familiar, suspicious, or out of place, that was enough. These technologies weren't designed to be fair. They were designed to be decisive. False positives were acceptable. False hesitation was not. And for a long time, they stayed where they belonged, embedded in military research, surveillance operations, and classified environments. There was no public rollout, no ethical framework, no discussion of long-term consequences, because none of that mattered in the original context. Then the environment changed. Cameras became cheaper, processing power increased, civilian infrastructure filled with lenses. Suddenly, a technology designed for hostile territory found a new landscape, one filled with ordinary people. The transition wasn't announced. It didn't feel like a shift. It was described as efficiency. Security checkpoints adopted it to reduce wait times. Police departments tested it to narrow suspect pools. Corporations used it to personalize experiences. Each use framed as reasonable. Each deployment described as limited. But the technology carried its original assumptions with it. Facial recognition doesn't ask for consent. It doesn't understand context. It doesn't question its own authority. It identifies, flags, categorizes, and once a face becomes data, it can be stored, shared, and repurposed indefinitely. What was built to spot threats in unfamiliar territory was now quietly mapping civilian life. Movement patterns, associations, habits. The battlefield logic remained intact. Detect anomalies, prioritize speed, accept error. But in civilian life, those errors weren't theoretical. They meant misidentification, unexplained scrutiny, invisible consequences, and there was no clear line between observation and judgment, because the system was never trained to distinguish the two. Facial recognition was never meant to decide who enters a store, who boards a plane, or who gets flagged by an algorithm. It was meant to operate where moral certainty had already collapsed. Once released into everyday life, it didn't adapt its values. Society adapted to it instead. Cameras became background noise. Identification became automatic. Being seen stopped feeling optional. And the most powerful feature of the technology wasn't recognition. It was normalization. Because once everyone expects to be seen, no one asks who's watching or why. Facial recognition was never designed to understand people. It was designed to act before understanding was possible. And when that logic crossed into civilian space, it didn't announce itself as a weapon. It arrived as a tool, already trained to decide first and explain later.
At first, the machines only watched. They transmitted video, tracked movement, followed instructions. Every decision still belonged to a human, but distance changes responsibility. As warfare moved farther from the battlefield, the delay between seeing and acting became a liability. Signals lagged, operators hesitated, targets disappeared. So a new question emerged inside military research programs. What if the machine didn't have to wait? Autonomous targeting systems were not built to replace humans. That was never the official goal. They were built to assist, to filter data, to rank threats, to suggest priorities. The language was careful. Decision support, human in the loop, supervised autonomy. But the logic underneath was simple. If a system could detect patterns faster than a human, if it could correlate behavior, movement, and probability, then waiting for confirmation became optional. Early systems were trained on vast datasets, images of vehicles, heat signatures, movement patterns over time. The goal wasn't recognition, it was prediction. Who is likely to act? Who is out of place? Who fits a threat profile? Once that profile was established, the next step was efficiency. Why alert a human to every possibility when the system could narrow it down to one? Why pause when the probability crossed a certain threshold? Gradually, the role of the human changed. From decision-maker to overseer. From actor to validator. And eventually, to fallback. The system didn't need emotion. It didn't need doubt. It didn't need context beyond what it was trained to see. It only needed confidence. And confidence could be calculated. These technologies were never meant to be public because they weren't meant to be understood. Their decisions weren't explained in reasons. They were expressed in outcomes. A target flagged, a strike executed, a result recorded. No debate, no hesitation. For years, this logic remained contained within conflict zones, remote, invisible. Then the boundary blurred. The same autonomy models began appearing in civilian systems. Self-driving vehicles, automated security platforms, predictive response software, different environments, same architecture. Detect, decide, act. What changed was not the capability, but the stakes. On a battlefield, uncertainty is expected. In civilian life, it's not. But autonomous systems don't understand that difference. They apply the same logic everywhere. Probability becomes justification. Speed becomes virtue. Intervention becomes rare. And once a system proves it can act without waiting, the temptation to let it do so grows. Not because it's perfect, but because it's consistent. Machines don't hesitate. They don't question orders. They don't feel the weight of consequence. They execute. Autonomous targeting was never meant to leave the battlefield because it assumes a world where mistakes are acceptable costs. When that assumption enters everyday systems, it doesn't announce itself. It hides behind optimization, behind efficiency, behind claims of safety. But the core decision has already been made. The moment a machine is allowed to choose when to act, the human role shifts permanently. Not from control to cooperation, but from authority to supervision. And supervision is always easier to abandon than control. These systems were never meant to operate in public life. Because once a machine learns how to decide, the question is no longer whether it should. It's whether anyone remembers how to stop it.
The technology didn't begin as a joke. It didn't start with memes, filters, or viral clips. It started with deception. Long before the word deepfake entered public language, military and intelligence researchers were already experimenting with synthetic media, not to entertain, but to mislead. The objective wasn't realism for its own sake. It was credibility. In information warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't firepower, it's belief. If a message looks authentic, sounds authentic, and appears to come from a trusted source, it doesn't need force to spread, it moves on its own. Early systems focused on voice replication. Could a machine reproduce speech patterns closely enough to pass as real? Could tone, cadence, hesitation, and emotional inflection be copied? The answer, quietly, became yes. Visual synthesis followed. Faces were reconstructed from limited data, expressions were mapped, movements approximated. Not perfectly, but convincingly enough. These systems weren't designed to fool everyone. They only needed to fool enough people, long enough, to shift perception. A single believable clip could destabilize trust, confuse command, or trigger premature reactions. That was the use case. No public release was planned because there was no civilian benefit. Synthetic media was considered too dangerous to circulate freely. Once the idea existed, that reality itself could be simulated, containment became the priority. But containment failed. As computing power spread and research leaked into civilian institutions, the technology escaped its original boundaries. At first, it seemed harmless. Entertainment adopted it. Marketing experimented with it. Social platforms amplified it. The tone changed. The intent softened. But the core capability remained the same. Deepfake systems don't create lies, they create uncertainty. They make evidence negotiable. They make denial plausible. They erode the idea that seeing is believing. And once that erosion begins, it doesn't matter how often the technology is used for harmless purposes. The damage is structural. In a world where any image can be fabricated, every image becomes suspect. Truth no longer collapses under falsehood, it dissolves under doubt. What began as a military experiment in psychological leverage became a civilian crisis of trust. And the public never agreed to that trade. Because deepfake technology was never meant to be used openly. It was designed for moments when confusion was the goal. Once released, it didn't need malicious intent to be dangerous. It only needed scale.
Platforms rewarded engagement. Algorithms amplified realism. Users shared before questioning. The result wasn't mass deception, it was mass hesitation. People stopped asking whether something was true. They started asking whether truth even mattered. And that shift is irreversible. Because a society that doubts everything can't coordinate, can't agree, can't respond decisively. Deepfake technology was never meant to be public because it attacks the foundation of shared reality. Once that foundation cracks, no authority can fully restore it. Not with fact checks. Not with disclaimers. Not with warnings. Because the problem isn't a single fake video. It's the permanent possibility that any video could be fake. And once that possibility becomes normal, the technology doesn't need to deceive anyone directly. It only needs to exist.
Encryption was supposed to be the line, the boundary between private and exposed, between personal thought and public access. If something was encrypted, it was meant to be unreadable, secure, final. That was the promise. But from the very beginning, governments never trusted encryption that they couldn't enter, not because they didn't understand it, but because they understood it too well. Strong encryption removes visibility, and visibility is power. So while public discussions framed encryption as a shield for citizens, parallel conversations were happening elsewhere. Quietly. What if the lock had a second key? What if access could be preserved without being visible? What if security could exist, but only conditionally? These ideas became known as backdoors. Not flaws, not accidents, design choices. In early cryptographic systems, certain weaknesses were deliberately introduced. Keys were shortened. Algorithms were classified. Standards were shaped behind closed doors. The justification was always the same. National security, law enforcement necessity, exceptional access. The public story insisted that these measures were limited, controlled, and rarely used. The internal reality was simpler. A system that can be opened once can be opened again, and a door that exists will eventually be found. Some backdoors were embedded in hardware, others in software, others in standards that appeared neutral on the surface, but favored specific capabilities. Most users never noticed. Their messages still sent, their files still locked, their systems still functioned. The encryption worked, until it didn't. And when access was needed, it didn't require breaking the lock. It required using the feature that was always there. What made these technologies never meant for public awareness wasn't their existence. It was their invisibility. Because once people believe encryption is absolute, behavior changes. They speak freely. They store more. They rely on privacy as a constant. Backdoors quietly reverse that assumption. They don't watch everyone all the time. They don't need to. They only need to make certainty impossible. And that uncertainty shifts power without resistance. Over time, pressure increased. As encryption spread across civilian devices, governments warned of going dark. They argued that visibility was being lost. What they rarely admitted was that visibility had already been preserved, just not publicly acknowledged. When leaks and investigations exposed some of these systems, the reaction wasn't denial. It was reassurance. You were told they were necessary. You were told they were targeted. You were told they were safe. But encryption doesn't recognize intent. A weakness for one party is a weakness for all. Once a backdoor exists, it becomes a liability. Not just to privacy, but to security itself. Foreign actors exploit it. Criminal groups find it. Systems built on trust inherit hidden fragility. And yet, the idea of removing backdoors always meets resistance. Because doing so would mean surrendering access. And access, once held, is never given up easily. Encryption backdoors were never meant to be public because they undermine the very concept they claim to protect. They turn privacy into a conditional privilege, security into a managed illusion. And the most effective part of the system isn't technical. It's psychological. Because as long as people believe their data is sealed, they behave as if it is. The door doesn't need to be opened often. It only needs to exist. And in a world built on encrypted trust, that existence quietly reshapes who holds control, without ever announcing itself.
For centuries, the weather was treated as fate. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, something humans adapted to, never commanded. That assumption didn't survive the 20th century. As military planning became more precise, strategists began to notice a weakness no army could fully solve. Logistics fail in bad weather. Visibility collapses. Movement slows. Supply lines break. So a quiet question emerged. What if the environment itself could be adjusted? Not controlled completely, just nudged. Small changes. Strategic timing. Enough to tilt outcomes. Early experiments focused on clouds, specifically precipitation. Scientists discovered that under certain conditions, rainfall could be encouraged by introducing particles into cloud systems. Not guaranteed, not dramatic, but statistically meaningful. And in warfare, probability is often enough. During conflicts in Southeast Asia, weather modification moved from theory to practice. The objective wasn't destruction. It was delay. Extend monsoon seasons, soften roads, flood supply routes, turn terrain into an obstacle. The technology didn't look like a weapon. No explosions, no visible force, just planes dispersing material into clouds far above the battlefield. To those on the ground, it looked like weather. And that was the point. No one was supposed to know. Because once weather becomes a tool, it stops being neutral. Rain is no longer rain. Drought is no longer chance. Nature becomes infrastructure. These operations were classified not because they failed, but because they worked well enough to matter. Public acknowledgement would have raised questions no one wanted to answer. Who controls the sky? Where does responsibility begin and end? What happens when manipulation spreads? So the programs stayed hidden. Until they didn't. When details eventually surfaced, the reaction was muted. No outrage. No reckoning. Most people dismissed it as a relic of a different era. But the technology didn't disappear. It evolved. Weather modeling improved. Data resolution increased. Simulation became more accurate. The ability to influence outcomes grew alongside the ability to predict them. And while overt military use became politically inconvenient, research continued in quieter forms. Civilian projects, environmental studies, climate intervention discussions, different language, similar mechanisms. The line between mitigation and manipulation blurred. What began as an attempt to gain tactical advantage introduced a deeper problem. Once humans accept that weather can be influenced intentionally, responsibility shifts. Disasters stop being purely natural. Outcomes feel negotiable. Blame becomes diffuse. And unlike conventional weapons, environmental effects don't respect borders. Rain falls where it will. Wind carries consequences outward. There is no clean containment. Weather modification was never meant to be public, because it challenges the idea of nature as a shared constant. If the environment can be adjusted, even slightly, power dynamics change invisibly. Decisions are made far from where consequences land. And once the sky becomes part of strategy, there is no clear way to return it to neutrality. Because the most unsettling part isn't that weather can be influenced. It's that when it is, no one can ever be sure whether what they're experiencing was accidental or chosen. And a world that can't tell the difference loses something more than predictability. It loses trust in the ground it stands on and the sky above it. At first, it sounded reasonable. If crime follows patterns, and patterns can be measured, then crime can be anticipated. That was the promise. Predictive policing didn't begin as control, it began as optimization. Police departments were overwhelmed. Resources were limited. Response times mattered. So analysts asked a seemingly neutral question. Where is crime most likely to happen next? Early systems didn't track people, they tracked locations. Historical reports, incident frequency, time of day correlations. The goal was efficiency. Deploy officers where probability was highest. No moral judgment, just data. But probability has a side effect. It reinforces itself. When patrols concentrate in certain areas, they observe more incidents. Those observations feed back into the system. The system grows more confident. Not because crime increased, but because attention did. Over time, the focus shifted. From places to people. If behavior could be quantified, risk could be assigned. Arrest records, associations, movement patterns. Individuals became profiles, and profiles became forecasts.
Who was likely to offend? Who was likely to escalate? Who required intervention? Before anything happened, the language remained careful. Risk assessment, preventative strategy, data-driven fairness. But the outcome was something else entirely. Because once a system predicts behavior, it begins to shape it. Increased surveillance leads to increased contact. Increased contact leads to increased records. Records confirm the prediction. The loop closes. People weren't being punished for crimes. They were being managed for probabilities. And probability doesn't allow rebuttal. You can't argue with a forecast. You can't appeal a correlation. You can't explain yourself to an algorithm. The system doesn't accuse. It expects. Predictive policing was never meant to be public because it changes the nature of judgment. Justice traditionally looks backward. It asks what happened. Prediction looks forward. It asks what might happen. And that shift matters. When decisions are made on anticipation, the future becomes constrained by the past. Opportunities narrow. Scrutiny follows. Freedom becomes conditional. And none of it feels dramatic. There's no announcement. No declaration of guilt. Just subtle pressure. More stops. More checks. More presence. Enough to alter behavior. Enough to fulfill the model. As these systems spread, they didn't remain confined to law enforcement. Schools adopted risk scoring. Employers used behavioral screening. Financial institutions assessed likelihood, not intent. The same logic applied everywhere. Predict the outcome. Act early. Reduce uncertainty. But uncertainty is where choice lives. And choice doesn't survive well inside models designed to minimize deviation. Predictive algorithms were never meant to define civilian life because they quietly replace responsibility with expectation. You are no longer judged by what you do. You are judged by what people like you have done before. And once that framework becomes normal, the future stops being open. It becomes pre-approved. The most unsettling part isn't that these systems can be wrong. It's that when they're right, they don't correct themselves. They simply tighten. More data, more confidence, less room to move. Predictive policing wasn't designed to ask whether a society should intervene early. It was designed to make early intervention feel inevitable. And when inevitability replaces choice, control doesn't need to announce itself. It just quietly rearranges the paths available, until the direction you're moving feels like the only one you ever had.
None of these technologies were introduced to the public with consent. They arrived through necessity, through emergencies, through promises that sounded temporary. Each one made sense at the time. Built for war, for security, for control in moments when control felt necessary. And once they worked, they were never fully withdrawn. Not because anyone voted to keep them, but because removing them felt riskier than leaving them in place. What started as classified solutions slowly became invisible infrastructure, quietly shaping decisions, quietly defining limits, not by force, but by normalization. The question was never whether these technologies were dangerous. It was whether society would notice when danger stopped feeling urgent. Because once something becomes ordinary, it stops being questioned. And once it stops being questioned, it no longer needs permission. These technologies were never meant to be public. But now that they are, the more important question isn't who built them. It's whether anyone still remembers what the world looked like before they were necessary, and whether that version of the future can still be reached, or whether the path has already closed behind us.